Next, let's talk about human population and migration in California. And one thing I'll point out is that the first half of the class, we've been focusing on the physical geography of California, its landforms, its waters, its weather and climate, plants, and so on. And at this point, we're really making a switch, and we're going to be covering more of the cultural or human geography of California, starting with its population, but also we'll be talking about economic activities, settlements, urban areas, that sort of thing, food, agriculture. And so to start with, let's talk about population in California. Let's talk about population over time. That the original inhabitants of California were Native Americans, which have been in California for more than 10,000 years. It's really hard to tell exactly, but it could be a very long time before 10,000 years. One reason it's hard to tell because sea levels have changed over time, and settlements that would have been on the coast of California, some of those may be underwater, but we know at least over 10,000 years, pretty much during the Holocene or since the Ice Ages. And had a population of up to 300,000. It's really hard to get a good population estimate, but that's sort of the best guess. But fairly low densities, that they didn't live in large settlements for the most part, less than 1 person per square mile. People were mostly hunters and gatherers and lived off the land, either through hunting or fishing or through foraging, things like acorns, for example. During this period, California was one of the most diverse language regions for Native Americans, and about 100 languages and 500 dialects. And one thing that helps to explain that is how the different types of environments in California. So the physical geography of California, we talk about its separate physical regions, and those separate physical regions also lead to different groups of people inhabiting these different physical regions. So the diversity with the mountains and coast ranges, the Sierra Nevada, that kind of isolates different groups and leads to wider diversity of linguistic groups. Now, the population was devastated after European settlement. That during the Spanish period, the population was cut in half. There wasn't that many Spanish that came to California, but it was a brutal period, and that really devastated their population. But after the gold rush, it really took a dive to where by 1900, about 1% of the original population was still here. So the population was for the most part displaced by the incoming settlers. So incredibly high amount of population loss over time. The first colonizing power, there had been settlements by Russians exploring down from Alaska and other kind of coastal explorations, but the Spanish were exploring by as early as the 1500s, so very early on, but didn't really start to settle in earnest in California until the 1700s. And they really stick to the cismontane or coastal areas because of the available water and resources there. The Spanish start what's called the mission period in California. So the Spanish settlements, if you've heard of missions in California, that was part of a way of organizing settlements by the Spanish. There were 21 missions up and down from San Diego, where they started, right from where Mexico is today, up to the kind of the North Bay area. There was also 4 presidios, and these are military installations meant to help protect the other settlements, and other small towns or pueblos. So for example, Los Angeles started as the Pueblo of Los Angeles. It just means sort of a small town or settlement that in this region. And the Spanish period ends in early 1800s when Mexico becomes independent. So now California goes from being a Spanish possession to being part of Mexico. One thing also that started, but really with the Spanish, but increased with the Mexican period, is the establishment of ranchos or land grants. These are where the government, to pay somebody, gives them plot of land within a territory. Before we go on, one other thing I want to mention is that the missions are connected by the El Camino Real. So if you've heard of El Camino Real in California, or the King's Road, that's kind of the road that connects all of the various missions and settlements. But there's also a lesser known road called El Camino Viejo, or the Los Angeles Road. It's kind of approximately about where Interstate 5 is today. And this was kind of a back road through the Central Valley that was utilized by the Spanish. It was not as heavily traveled as El Camino Real, but it was just an interesting side note. Now back to land grants or ranchos. So within this period, the government would, from the Spanish and then increasingly with the Mexican government, would give plots of lands to people for payment. Now this is a map showing the kind of the location of a land grant. Some of these were pretty approximate maps. That would be about here in sort of Fresno and Merced County. And this would be the San Joaquin River. And so it's using landmarks to kind of mark out where this land grant was. One thing to note is that these were not very heavily populated. A lot of these were cattle operations and very sparsely populated, but these were areas that were kind of given to people in kind of the main settlements during the Mexican period. Now, well, California was sparsely populated. You had started to see an increase of people pioneering through the Sierra Nevada and other places, and you had increasing settlement by people from eastern United States. And then things really changed in about 1848 with the discovery of gold in California. So if you hear the name 49ers, they're named for the year 1849, the year after gold was discovered, when you had this massive influx of people into California. One thing I should note too is that right around 1848, that's also when California becomes a U.S. territory. It was ceded by a treaty right around 9 days within when gold was discovered. So the gold discovery news didn't get out till right after California became a territory. So very unfortunate for Mexico in that regard. With the discovery of gold, though, you have a massive influx of people across the country. I assigned an extra video called The West that talks about that, but just people just flooded in once word got out in 1849. And ever since that time, you've just had a massive increase of people coming into California. So population growth in California has exceeded that of the United States from that about 1850 till today. It's changing a little bit today. We'll talk about that later. Now, one thing that dramatically increased population is transportation. So once the Transcontinental Railroad was completed in the late 1800s, that made it much easier to travel to California. And population initially focused around the Bay Area, but by the late 1800s, the Los Angeles area caught up with San Francisco, and these become the two main population centers of California.